Hey everyone, welcome back to my 7-part series, How to Step Up Your Lightroom Game. In this tutorial, we're going to be walking through part 2 of that, which is managing your catalog. Managing your catalog is one of the most important, as well as probably underestimated parts of your workflow, much like the part 1 with storage and backup. You really want to be managing your catalog to make sure your tool is equipped for performance. So we're going to be talking a lot about preferences, previews, how to prep your previews, how to set your preferences, and different ways to navigate a catalog, multiple catalogs, and most importantly, working in a single catalog workflow. I can't stress enough why I work in a single catalog. I start with my one catalog and I end with it. So everything, all the changes I'm doing metadata wise, importing previews all happen in one place. So we're going to be walking through how to set up a plan because when it comes to workflow, you have to make a plan and you have to stick to it, right? Most important part, so that way you don't get stuck in the mud when you're too busy to redevelop your new processes or think on the fly, right? So you want to have a plan, stick to it, so you know what you need to do as soon as you get in Lightroom. When it comes to this 7-part workflow series, I'm going to be talking a lot about, we've already looked at storage and backing up files. We're going to be talking about managing your catalogs now. And then moving on to you'll be ready to cull your images, color correct them, develop creative edits, export to Photoshop, organize and sort, all those things, doing all that stuff in one place. That's what I'm going to show you in this 7-part series. Let's jump into prepping your previews and importing our files as we've done here into Lightroom. All right, now we're ready to import our files and prep Lightroom with previews. So what we can do is we can go into the import module and you can either choose your files here on the left hand side, as I've talked about how to add or copy, all those kind of things. For this specific tutorial, I've already backed up, I've already stored my files, so I just need to add them into Lightroom here. So I want to make sure that that's clear, that we're just adding files, we're not having to make copies at this point. What I like to do is just quickly grab the folder from Finder or my whatever file app I'm using and just drag and drop it in here so the files show up. So there's nothing really out of the ordinary here that we need to talk about other than file handling. That's the most important part of this process, right? So typically what I would do when I didn't really know much about Lightroom or I was doing culling outside of Lightroom is I would bring in minimal because I wanted the files to be added or copied into Lightroom as soon as possible. And I didn't really understand what previews did. I didn't know anything until I did some research and a few different colleagues kind of helped me out with previews, why, previews, and when. That's what we're going to talk about here, right? So we want to add our files into Lightroom. We want to get working on them later, right? So if I want to have the best previews, to reduce the amount of load time while I'm calling, while I'm editing, doing anything extensive develop-wise in Lightroom. I definitely want to do one-to-one previews, and I want to set smart previews. So the reason why I'm doing both of these settings here is because I want to be able to fly through images, which is what smart previews are going to let me do, image to image, move super fast. So it's not having to relook at the RAWs, re-access that data. It's using the smart preview that it builds. A smart preview, to give you paint a picture for you, you have a raw file, these Canon raw files here, which are like 35 megabytes a piece. You can only imagine 31 megabytes, how long that would take to load each one. It's a lot of data. What I like to do is use smart previews because it creates a DNG file or copy of this raw to make it super fast for you to go image to image to image when you're cycling between them. That's why I choose smart previews. One-to-one previews, which are very important when I want to zoom into a file. When I zoom into it, and let's just show you specifically how that works. I'm only going to do it with a few of them because it takes a while to load. So I am going to uncheck all my files and I am going to choose for it to do it on this one file here. Let's just do it on two. Why not? We'll do import, and what it's going to do is it's going to add those files to the catalog. It's going to build the smart previews. Smart previews are done, and one-to-one previews are done. So when I'm going image to image here, it's going to be lightning fast, right? Of course, it's only 2 files, so keep in mind it's going to take a little bit longer with more. But when we zoom in here, the most important part that you have to remember is it's not having to do a whole bunch of loading. Usually you'll get like a loading mark here, and I'll show you specifically what happens with that, right? So we can put this in practice. So if I do minimal and I do smart previews, which is perfectly fine, let's bring in some more files here, and we'll just start importing all of them, right? It's going to exclude the 2 I've already brought in. Let's just start importing this now. So as I go to all photographs, and it's going to start loading my files for me, now I can go in and zoom out. At this view, it's not going to be too bad. It's kind of running a little sluggish because I'm importing the files, and it's having to do all that work, which it's still doing here. So it's going to import those files pretty fast. Keep in mind, I'm importing them from my local SSD drive, which is the same drive the catalog's on. That's not the best way to operate. It's definitely going to be the fastest. If you can get SSD drives, it's only going to be fast. You want to make sure you're interfaced. We talked about in the last article, USB 3.1 Generation 2, or for Apple users, Thunderbolt 3 or at least Thunderbolt 2 is a good option. But you can see the smart previews are going to start generating. They're not going super fast, but they're going pretty well for the moment. Here's where it becomes interesting, right? So we did minimal. So we can go image to image. You can hear my fan running on my laptop. It's going, so it's definitely crunching. But when we zoom in here, here's what's interesting, right? Load. It's going to have to build a one-to-one preview per file. So in order for me to have optimal sharpness and to make sure what I'm looking at is correct, is you see it kind of render, and it's a little bit easier once we get some shots on him, because we want to make sure the eyes are sharp. We're not focused on the eyelashes, we're not focused on his nose, we're not focused on anything else. We want to make sure when we're going through these images and we're calling, these images are actually sharp. So as you can see how long this is taking, this would be a huge pain in the butt, and why most people likely don't use Lightroom to do any calling, because of how long it takes for you to get from here to here for it to load. Now I'm obviously zoomed in one-to-one, as you can tell right here. So as I'm going through these files, I might not be at that view 100%, but I want to zoom in now on his eye to make sure it's sharp. And that amount of time it's going to take to load to make sure it's not actually soft and that this image is actually sharp, that amount of time is not one that I can take. So keep in mind, smart previews are going to help you image to image navigate, run through them, but you're still building standard previews in the background, which we'll get to in a second. But these one-to-one previews are very important. So what I like to do as a standard, if I'm going to do everything in Lightroom and I don't need to call right away, is I'm going to build one-to-one previews from the get. So for a 4,000, 5,000 image job, it's probably going to take 4 to 5 hours for those to render. Obviously, those times probably will change between um, computer to computer, external hard drives, things like that. Let's move on, right? So the biggest thing is if you want to call now, Lightroom added a pretty interesting feature here with embedded and sidecar files. So let's go ahead and I'm going to cancel my import and just remove these files real quick. We'll just remove them from the catalog. And what I want to do is show you the embedded and sidecar previews. So this is a pretty interesting option that Lightroom's brought in. It's directly trying to compete with Photo Mechanic. As we all know, Photo Mechanic is the end-all be-all for calling. For many of you that want to use Lightroom for everything, not kind of bounce around between both programs, Lightroom gives you this option to import and give you a preview that's generated from the raw file, the JPEG preview, to get calling much faster. So let's see how it actually works, right? So if we want to add our files, we're going to choose this option right here, embedded in sidecar file. This is new, a new Lightroom Classic feature. I'm not going to choose Smart Previews just so this thing can get going. So once we grab some files here, I'm not going to import all of them. I don't think we need to, but I definitely want to kind of run into some images. I think these will be perfectly fine to do, and we'll just select the first set of images here. Let's just choose 25 for the sake of numbers. So we're going to go ahead and click import, and these files are going to be instantly added. Fetching initial previews. I mean, it's pretty quick for 25. It builds those quite quickly. Now that we have a embedded preview, you have to keep in mind preferences, and we'll get to more of these in just a second, but there are a few things. If you want to replace that, I'm going to go ahead and uncheck those options for now, just to make sure it doesn't mess with my embedded previews. That's a very important option there, just so it doesn't build standard previews on top. And let's see if there's any other options here that I need to choose. Previews in parallel, I think that's fine. File handling, just making sure it's not going to replace my previews. So embedded preview, okay, what does that mean? I zoom in, right? So now I can go image to image, and it's lightning fast with that one-to-one preview. You're seeing this right away. I didn't have to build anything. I just go right into the file, and it's super fast, right? Now it's not going to be perfect. So it's, in my opinion, it's not good. It's not as good as a one-to-one preview. But if you want to get culling, or if you want to do some down and dirty edits, and you want to get working on these files and be able to zoom in, zoom out, it's going to give you that option to do it. Now, of course, if we go 3-to-1, there's going to be a little bit of a, you're not getting a 100%, you're getting a 300% here. So keep in mind everything's going to kind of look soft, but you're just hitting the space bar and you're toggling between images. So you can do this with all 4,000 images if you wanted to quickly go through, grab some images to do some down and dirty edits. It's a pretty awesome option to do. Now, when I want to get editing, to jump ahead a little bit to talk about the do's and don'ts of the embedded preview, it's going to, let's just go ahead and click auto. I know I'm going to hate this, but now it's going to render a preview. And you'll notice when we jump back, we've lost our embedded preview. So the embedded preview goes away as soon as you go into develop mode. It has to generate a standard preview. That's something to keep in mind. So if you're going to do this, keep in mind it is only for culling. It is only for library mode. As soon as you take an image into develop mode, your preview goes away. So keep that in mind. You can do standard size previews for all the photos, build one, cancel. So if you have this preference turned on to replace embedded previews with standard ones, once it's sitting, it's likely just going to start updating those in the background for you. Another option, previews here in library, you can always build previews later. So a lot of people don't know this. It's not just a one-time thing. If you want to rebuild one-to-one previews, you can. You just click it in your library top menu bar, and it's pretty quick to do so. So once it starts building those, you have those one-to-one previews, and it's not going to make you load every time, right? So again, prep with previews, super important. Let's move on to a few options here in the preferences panel that I like to use. Real quick, for catalog settings, this automatically discard one-to-one previews after 30 days. I think this is important because your previews file gets pretty big. Keep in mind when it's tallying all this information, that previews file gets pretty large, and we'll jump into these different standard preview sizes and things like that. But those are the biggest things, right? The biggest changes between embedded sidecar previews, I want to call now, great option to use. You want to call later, but have everything ready to render and moving as fast as possible, use one-to-one. I definitely recommend that. But above all, build smart previews. It's one of the best features in Lightroom to improve your performance. Let's move on to preferences and how preferences equal performance in Lightroom. All right, So Lightroom preferences, whether it's for the catalog or your general preferences, are always going to equal performance for you. So before you get started, if Lightroom is running slow, I always recommend starting with quitting your Adobe Creative Cloud Manager, signing out, signing back in. If things are running funny, always check for updates. You always want to make sure your program is staying up to date. Work in the latest version of Lightroom Classic, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of standard 101 software protocol when things are running slow or funny. Now that we have that ruled out, let's make sure this catalog, this master catalog, is fit for performance. So holding Command and hitting the comma key opens up General Preferences. Option Command comma is going to open up Catalog Settings. So in starting out with catalog settings and making sure our catalog is the most optimal, or running at optimal performance, you want to make sure that you optimize the catalog. It's a pretty simple option, right? You go to File, click on Optimize Catalog, and click Optimize. If you don't do this ever or have it run at every time you close out of Lightroom, this may take a while to do. That's always like sort of a simple thing to kind of get rid of any cache files, kind of make the catalog a little more lean and get rid of any temporary files, things like that. So that's a pretty quick tip there, but running into preferences, let's jump into catalog settings. So in the file handling tab, you're going to notice that you have preview cache. Well, it's what previews we just talked about, prepping on previews. Why is this important to you now? Well, every time you make a change in Lightroom, a standard preview is going to have to regenerate, right? So when you make an adjustment to the raw, Lightroom has to show you visually what you did. So you want to make sure you're running the right settings in the standard preview size, right? So auto means that it's going to read your laptop screen here, and I'm going to jump into, jump into system preferences to show you what my screen size is showing and how this, oh, wrong button. Okay, sorry. Let's go to system preferences and go to displays. And you're not really going to see anything going on here. So how do we know what the scale is? Well, we click on scale, and the default setting is showing, looks like 1680 by 1050. Well, why is this automatically going to 3360, right? Well, it's because I'm on a Retina display, and the actual size, if I were to take a screenshot real quick, so you hear that noise. If you take a screenshot, this will actually tell you um, what your actual screen size is. So it's actually correct, right? 3360 is what the full pixels, the actual amount of pixels count on the longest edge for me. So keep in mind when you're changing these settings, you want to make sure that the standard preview size is meeting at least that. Well, I don't need anything that in-depth on a standard preview. I have one-to-one previews. Those kind of things don't matter to me. So letting this automatically run is just going to slow down the computer and generate a massively large standard preview every time I make a change. So I don't want to do that. So here's what I want to do. I want to make sure from, it looks like preferences 1680. I want to find a preview size that's pretty close to that. So we can do 1680, right? If I want it to be lightning fast, I'll choose 1024. But for this computer, I'll make sure that everything renders at 1680. I'll also make sure my preview quality is low because I don't care about standard previews. I only care about the one-to-one previews and the smart. So again, just to walk you through, I'm saying previews a lot and throwing a lot of terms at you. I don't want to confuse you. We built smart previews so that way we could go image to image super fast. So it doesn't have to access the one-to-one. It doesn't have to access the standard preview from the raw every time. It has the smart preview. It's just a virtual, it's just a DNG file that makes it super fast. These standard previews, we want to make them as small, and you want to make the preview cache size as lean as possible, which means that it doesn't have to render a large preview. It's super fast. All these other settings are perfectly fine to do. Going into the metadata settings, you want to make sure automatically write XMPs is unchecked. Why is this important? Well, if it's turned on, it's going to write an XMP to the RAWs, which saves data outside of Lightroom, which does another task, meaning that it's going to take some CPU, RAM. It's going to take a lot of energy to do that. I always leave that unchecked. I don't care about saving XMPs every time I make a change. That's crazy. So running into File handling, we're all good there. The general tab is very important. You want to choose what Lightroom does every time it exits, right? So you can have it back up never, back up every time Lightroom exits, which is what I recommend. We'll cover why this is important in just a minute. So make sure, keep this in mind. You can make a screenshot of your computer to see what your actual resolution size is here as we did. Let's move on to general preferences, right? So once I click X off that, it's going to save that for this catalog every time. So even if I quit this, and just show you, so you're probably thinking, oh, do I have to do this every time I open a catalog? How am I going to remember those settings? You know, the great thing about Lightroom is it's going to save those default settings in this particular catalog every time. So when I go back there, just to show you, boom, they're right there. So if you have multiple catalogs and you're doing that, it's going to go back to the default settings every time. Keep that in mind. If you create a new catalog or you're working in a different one, these settings will go back to default, which is medium and auto. You just have to come back in here and recheck those. So when the catalog's running slow, you do your little sign out, sign in trick, restart your computer, check on your catalog settings here for standard previews. Those kind of things can really help. So let's move into general preferences. I don't want to get too long-winded on that. I always choose these two to be check marked. So that way it automatically starts generating standard previews in the background if I import with embedded previews, just for the sake of rendering those in the background. Because again, when we brought the files in with the embedded previews, remember that a standard preview didn't generate until I took it into develop mode, which is kind of a problem if it's sitting idle or the library is not doing anything. So if I want those to run automatically, I can check that. Treat JPEGs next to the raw files as a separate photo. In case I have a JPEG that's named the same as the raw file, I want it to show up in Lightroom, right? So moving into some quick settings, show splash screen. I always uncheck that. I think that's a very important option. If you want to, and I recommend this, if you want this main catalog to open up at default every time you open up Lightroom, awesome setting to choose right there. Okay, so let's run into performance, right? Everything we need to know about performance is in the performance tab. Finally, right? It's not in 6 different places, it's right here. So running down the list, use graphics processor. I am a huge advocate for always unchecking this option. The reason why is because I don't care about the um, using the processor as well as Lightroom, especially when I'm going image to image. I don't want it to take forever as I'm going through these. So you never really know if your processor is going to handle these kind of changes or not well. So I always want to make sure that I'm not slowing down Lightroom and things like that. So I always make sure that I have this unchecked. I don't want to use my graphics processor to help. The raw cache settings here, always set that to 100. If your catalog's running slow, you can always click on the purge cache button, so that will alleviate your caches here in your camera raw folder. Moving down here, hover over presets, preview of presets in loop. That's just these options here. So of course, it's not doing it for me right now, but if I wanted it to work, let's go back into this photo. If I wanted it to show up, that's the setting to do it with. So let's check that. Right now it's changing all those. So just some things to keep in mind as those things are working. You have all your different black and whites too. So um, that's just one of those kind of, you can turn it off. I don't like it to show up just to slow things down. Use smart previews instead of originals. Always have this checked. Before, you'd have to kind of go in and trick your catalog by unlinking the files here. You know, where you're getting the question marks to where it's just a smart preview, right? So we can still edit on this file without the original, but being that we're working on a smart preview, it's so much faster than having those raws, right? So something to keep in mind for those smart previews and having that option checked. Very, very important. Above all, let's move down to the optimize option, right? So every time I close this catalog out, we'll hit yes, right? So it didn't give me that backup option that I wanted. So I click on the Lightroom Classic down here at the bottom, automatically opens up this catalog for me. We want to make sure our catalog settings are the same, which they are. We'll go to General. We need to click on when Lightroom exits. So I quit Lightroom again. Yes, of course I want to quit. Now it's going to pop this up. So we want to do this every time Lightroom exits. You want to make sure your backup is going to somewhere offshore. What I mean by that is you probably want to use a cloud drive or at least an external hard drive for your, the very least, for this backup to go to, because when it saves this backup of this catalog, in case this one we're working in or your hard drive becomes corrupt or crashes, you don't lose all of your Lightroom work. You definitely want to do a backup and optimize the catalog every time it closes. So whenever you do that, you just run the backup and it saves that into a new location, which for me on the Google Drive is a great option to do because it's going to save this locally, then it's going to sync it with my Google Drive option, which is pretty great. So it actually compresses this much faster because it will create a zip file. So what's nice is it starts syncing this file once it's done and uploading. So it's good to have it synced to a local folder so that way it can start uploading that file directly to my Google Drive just so it's saved online in case my computer crashes or I want to access the catalog from another computer and I don't have the original catalog saved to it. I just download it there and I'm done, and that's the latest version. Let's move in to a few different ways to export as a catalog and import as a catalog. Two pretty awesome features to move into with managing catalogs. All right, so now we're ready to show how you can export as a catalog. And you might be thinking, well, if we're working in one catalog, why would I create second ones? That seems kind of stupid, right? Well, of course, if you outsource your editing, this is that stage where you'd have to export as a catalog for that team to work on. Or if you want to work on a smaller catalog remotely and you don't want to take your master catalog, you don't want to have to take your raw files, you just want to work remotely on a different machine or something like that, this is a perfect place to export as a catalog. So if I want to say, you know what, I five-starred, these 1,200 images, I just want to work on these on maybe my laptop or I'm on a different machine or traveling. And I don't want to have to take the raws, things like that, but I just want to continue editing, cropping, develop mode, doing, pretty, a lot of developed settings and things like that. I can do it, right? So what you can do is you can go up to File and choose Export as Catalog. Um, Now it's very important to make sure that you have the images selected here as we have as we're ready to export. So what I mean by that is if you don't have, like for instance, if we had just those selected and I wanted to do export it as a catalog, it's going to show export selected files only, or we can export all of them, right? So if I only want the 1,207 files to export, make sure you're only exporting the selected ones. Now there's an option here to export negative files. Again, if you wanted to package these 1,207 raw files, save new copies of them to this same folder that we're going to create with the new catalog, you can do that. That's what export negative files are. It'll package just these raw files, not all 4,000. Pretty interesting feature if you want to export or hand off just a select few raw files and save copies. You can do that. Include available previews is useless for me. I only want to take my smart previews with me, and for this purpose, I don't want to take any raws. I don't need them. I just want to have smart previews, and I want to run this. So when I export this catalog, I might name it, the 6, 18, 19. I might only name it what the specific event is called, throw it to my desktop, and I'm ready to export. So what this process is going to do is it's going to build and make sure there's a smart preview for every file. Any of the files that there aren't smart previews for, of course it's going to build it. But once this process is done, you'll have a completely separate catalog on your desktop here and smart previews all packaged into a new folder. And what you can do with that is you can take that catalog, put it on another computer, external hard drive, and start working on that separately from your master. It's pretty awesome. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. We will Cancel the entire export. Now, if I wanted to import from another catalog, which I can do, it's the same process really. You can go here to import from another catalog, or we can just choose a catalog in our desktop. So let's see here, May 2019. Let's just look up. So if I have any catalogs here that I'd want to import into, you know, maybe a new client altogether I'd want to bring in. It was a separate catalog. It'll let me do that. New photos, all 100 of them, we can do that. No problem. So if I do have a separate catalog and I want to combine it into this one, or if I've been doing work in an external catalog, it's pretty simple to do. I just drag the catalog into library mode, and it automatically will import these files for me. So it makes it super fast to transfer metadata catalog to catalog, of course, between these. Now these files, these aren't the right files, of course, that are in here, but you can see how quickly and easy it is to, let's just hit remove, how easy it is to import from another catalog. So we can do it again if we want to find maybe a different version of this catalog we were working in. Drag and drop it in here. And to go through these options, it's very important to choose the right settings when you're importing, right? So is it's going to check this catalog. It might take a little bit of time for larger catalogs when you're importing, but there's going to be a few things you want to make sure. It's going to show you that it's going to change existing photos. No new photos were found. Both of these options are checked. You can see show preview. There's no preview available, so that just becomes useless for you. One of the biggest options in here, and you want to make sure never to check, is the preserve old settings as a virtual copy. Now, of course, if you want to see maybe what a different editor did besides what you were doing, or you want to create copies, actually, this is a perfect option to keep in mind. So say you exported a catalog, had somebody else maybe call, edit, sort, crop, whatever they're doing for you. You're sending your work for them to do, and then they're going to send it back. Maybe you were making some adjustments in your catalog, tagging images, editing them, cropping them, maybe throwing up some sneak peeks. So if you don't want to lose your settings, you can make sure that your settings stay as well as bringing theirs in. Now it's going to, double up all of your images, of course. So if you've got 4,600, now you're going to have, well over 9,000 files. But this is the option you would do it to, so that way you don't lose your metadata. But in a different regard, you just click import, and it brings all of that data, and it changes all of the files in there for you right away. So import, export as catalog, very important part of managing your catalog and understanding, working in a single master catalog, how you can sort of navigate and do a few things like that. All right, so I have some final tips for you for managing your catalogs to make sure that this master catalog is best prepped to be the keeper of all your metadata changes. So it's very important when you're doing your renaming, your custom ordering, your capture time syncing, all that kind of stuff is all done in this master catalog, because when you're changing, more specifically, you're syncing capture time, you don't want to do that anywhere else other than your master catalog. In case you need to revert things back and change some of this information, like for instance, if we just want to change these 5 stars, let's go in here to these 1207. If we want to change or sync capture time, well, I keep clicking the same button here. Hold on one sec. We need to click the metadata button here. So if we want to change this date, and it was actually on the 18th, across these, we'll do change all. If this was shot on, a different day of the week, want to make sure that that data changes correctly. And if for whatever reason we want to revert this back, revert this capture time back, you have The original time, the corrected time, it can't be undone. Sure. So when we uncheck there and go back into our 5 stars, it's all saying June's the capture date, and we're able to sort everything correctly. Now this also says in 2018, so if the year's off, anything's wrong with the camera, you can change all of that information um, immediately. So as you see, it's automatically kind of sorting it between these two, so that way the dates change correctly. Now, of course, if you want to take this back, um, you're noticing that it's changing the original date too. So we can do that, and that'll help when you're working between cameras, of course, right? So if the cameras are off and you're breaking it down by serial number, that becomes very important to make sure everything is in sync more specifically. So if between cameras these things are happening at different time, you can sync those up a little bit better. But these cameras are already in sync, so there's really no issues there. Some other options too, of course, if you want to rename all these files, I always recommend doing it in this catalog versus at export, because if you do it at export, more specifically, let's see here. If you rename at export, it's going to create a new version of the file, but not necessarily a RAW. So if you're going to export JPEGs, you know, you're not going to have a RAW file with that same name. So I like to make sure it's done properly in the library module. So I'll select all, and then I'll do my renaming here to change that. So if I want to edit and do something custom, um, you know, as I normally do, 16, 16, 19 underscore the name, the wedding, and then underscore a sequence of 4. So each file gets this change here. So that way it actually changes the RAWs. It's all in this catalog. And what's really cool about this is when I change all these, and of course it's going to tell me that I can't do it on a handful, but it's actually going to change all these file names for me. You'll notice this will change right there. Let's see here. If I want to show in Finder, that's my option I was looking for, it's going to show it right here. So you see that they all changed in the original home folder, which is great. But now let's say I made a mistake and for some reason I need to revert them back to the originals. This is a perfect case in point, right? So if you want to revert your files back to the originals, you can. It's pretty simple to do. So you go back to edit. We will clear all this out, right? So you have original file name. Look at that. Boom. You can take it right back to the original. Click done and click OK. Now because we did this in the original, and they're all going to revert back. Because we did this in one catalog, you can revert it back in the same catalog. So keep in mind, if you rename the files, import them into a new catalog, or export that catalog, you won't have this option to do it. So I can't reiterate enough how important it is to make changes in one place, because in the case that you need to revert it back, you have the ability to do that in this catalog. I think that's a huge kind of miss for a lot of photographers. There are catalogs all over the place, moving files around, files get renamed and they're screwed, right? So you always want to make sure, when you're renaming, whether that's at import in Lightroom after the fact, that you have one version, you have multiple versions of the files, but they're all named the same. That becomes very important. Some other options that you can do too, which I find to be pretty interesting, is you can have multiple. You might have noticed that I have multiple copies of Classic opened. You can do that pretty easily by going into your Lightroom Classic option here, right-clicking on it, and just choosing Duplicate. It'll create a new or a duplicate version of this Lightroom Classic application, so you can have multiple catalogs open at once. Now, I don't recommend doing more than 3 or 4. We'll choose a different catalog. We'll have it open sure. I don't recommend doing the, if you're working on a laptop or a slower machine, it might run slower having multiple catalogs open. I've tested it with 3 to 4, and it usually doesn't have too many issues. So if you want to, say for instance, if you're working in multiple separate catalogs, this is for somebody that doesn't follow the single catalog workflow, which is fine. It's not for everyone, but you can have multiple catalogs open with this, which becomes, kind of a interesting workflow tool. So if you want to build standard previews on this catalog and have that running in the background, you can. And you can work in your original catalog, this one here, and start exporting files and things like that. So you can have multiple exports going on. I know in Lightroom it usually limits, I think, 4 exports at a time when you're going out of one catalog. So you could have multiple catalogs opened up, running multiple different tasks, things like that. It just becomes a little more, gives you a little more flexibility. Lightroom, it's not one catalog at a time. You can literally duplicate applications and run multiple catalogs at once. I think that's a pretty cool feature and tip for managing catalogs. But that's it. Let's get to the wrap up and close this one out. All right, so there you have it. Managing your catalog is as important as managing your files, right? It all starts there. If you're not managing that aspect of your workflow, you're probably going to have a crappy time getting through Lightroom. You're gonna most likely be like most photographers and cursing the crap out of Lightroom Classic. It's not a perfect program by any means, but it's definitely the standard for a reason. But you still have to understand fundamentally how Lightroom works, how to make sure you have optimal performance, preferences, and things like that. So spend the time and set up Lightroom right. If you do it once, if you stick to that plan, I promise you'll be happy down the road. Because you have to think about Lightroom as a digital asset manager, because it is, right? Damn, right? It's managing all of your files, all of your assets. Make sure to use it for that, right? To organize, to sort, to edit, to export, metadata, keywords, all that kind of stuff becomes so important for your files. Do it in one place, use one program, become a master of Lightroom. I highly recommend doing that. It's just easier to do the same thing over and over again versus bouncing around in multiple programs and workflows and rewriting stuff. Of course, you want to update, you want to revise your workflow, but use the slower time of the year to do that, right? Don't learn something and then keep changing it every month. Do it for an entire year. Write down what your hangups are, the issues that you run into. Do some research in the meantime, but make sure you stick to the plan. I can't reiterate that enough. One of the biggest things with Lightroom I think a lot of users forget about are prepping previews, using it the right way, but also working in multiple applications. We looked at duplicating the application. I think that becomes more than just a cool feature, but a very useful one if you want to have multiple catalogs running and you're exporting and things like that. I think that can be very helpful if you outsource your work or use a different machine when you want to create separate catalogs, things like that. Many people are using iPad Pros and using, different apps to do their culling and editing, which I think is kind of cool. For me, being a little more classic, no pun intended, I like to work on a computer at a desk. I'm sort of, that's my time. So I prep everything there and have kind of the workhorse. But just showing you some of that stuff on the laptop, you can be a little bit flexible with catalogs, just the way that we're prepping previews. But those preferences we talked about, the catalog preferences and the different preferences for your general performance preferences, these things are so important because if you overlook these or forget to check those options and the catalog's running slow, you kind of just think, well, Lightroom sucks, I'll just deal with it. Well, it's not a just deal with it situation. It's making sure your tool, your preferences are correct, because preferences equal performance. Rendering and prepping previews removes frustration. So keep that in mind, how important previews and preferences out of everything you've learned so far in this 7-part workflow series. Think about those two words and keep that in mind when running Lightroom. So next month, we're going to be running into part 3 of my 7-part series, culling and sorting your files. So many of you are probably going to skip this option because you're like, I use Photo Mechanic, screw it. I'm not going to use Lightroom. That's dumb. That's fine. I'm not here to change your mind, change your workflow. That's not a problem. Keep using Photo Mechanic and it's great. For a lot of you out there that are just using Lightroom, maybe you're culling in it, maybe you're not, maybe you're cursing Lightroom because it's running slow. I promise you, I will show you how to cull and sort your files as fast as possible because we've already done this prep work. We've already set you up for success. So now you'll be ready to actually step up your Lightroom game and use one program to do everything in one place. So tune in next month, culling and sorting.